We are underway. I'll hand it over to Dr. Bentley. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Andrew. Kia ora koutou. Hena iwi a pane, tēnā koutou. Good afternoon, everyone. I've had a lifelong interest in reading and writing and researching about the interaction of Māori and Pākehā in pre-treaty New Zealand, especially the Pākehā who crossed cultures voluntarily and involuntarily and lived as Māori in Māori communities. And that fascination began about the age of 13 when I read this book called Old New Zealand by Frederick Manning, which some of you no doubt have read. I think there's 27 known editions. It's the most published book in New Zealand. And it's a colonial classic. It describes the adventures of a Tasmanian who arrived here, I think, about 1832, lived and traded at the Hokianga. And that fascination was increased when I read stories about John Rutherford in that book called The White Chief by James Drummond. He was captured by Ngāti Kahungunu when his ship was attacked, the Agnes, an American whaler, in 1816, and rose to the rank of Rangatira Pākehā, or White Chief. Returned to England and made a living exhibiting his tā moko tattoos, telling about his adventures in a travelling circus. Also, another book you may be familiar with is James Cowan's The Adventures of Kimball Bent, the story of a soldier who deserted the 50s. He was actually American. He joined the British 57th Regiment and deserted. And basically lived and died as a Maori slave. Quite extraordinary. So over the last, over many years, I've written lots of essays, 2 university theses, many journal articles about these culture-crossing men and women. And in the last 20 years, 5 books about them. And the first book in 1999 was titled Pākehā Māori, The Extraordinary Story of the Europeans Who Lived as Māori in Early New Zealand. And that describes the runaway convicts and sailors, traders, shore whalers, sawyers, who lived as Pākehā Māori, or white men gone native. Some of them were fully indigenised, some of them were partly indigenised or assimilated. The second book was titled Captured by Māori, White Female Captives, Sex and Racism on the 19th Century New Zealand Frontier. And that certainly shattered a few stereotypes for me and for my readers. I assume when I started out researching this topic, the story of 7 European women and 2 girls captured by the tribes, they were shipwrecked or caught in the fighting between Māori and Pākehā, that they would be badly treated, beaten, tortured, raped, murdered, cooked and devoured, and the opposite was the case. They were all very carefully nurtured, raised as whangais or adoptees, given mentors to guide them in Maori communities. 2 of them chose to remain in Māori communities. So it was a really interesting research process. I hated the title that Penguin gave this book, Cannibal Jack. He was much more than a white cannibal, although he did admit, like 4 other tattooed men, participating in cannibalism. But the book illustrates the way that during the 1800s, men and some women had to take on multiple jobs to survive. And Jack Marmon was not only a warrior who fought for the tribes, but as times changed, he became a publican, a farmer. He was a sailor, of course, and he changed roles and occupations many times. And I think some of you can relate to that, your own ancestors. My own ancestors certainly had to be multi-skilled. I'll tell you more about this, the 4th book, Tribal Guns and Tribal Gunners, in a moment, the story of Maori artillery. My most recent book, well, it came out in the bookshops Monday last week. and it's called Pākehā Slaves Marry Masters. It describes or maintains that all Europeans living in New Zealand before the treaty were either slaves, and many of them were, or tributary vassals. So were the missionaries, the sawyers, the shore whalers again, the timbermen. To remain and succeed in their enterprises, they had to pay tribute to the chiefs to access Māori labour, lands, resources. But I see it's been red stickered by the publishers. It's not shown here, but there's a large red sticker which says, warning, the contents of this book may offend some readers, which I'm really annoyed about. But I won't go into that, otherwise we won't get our presentation done today. This year I'm editing a New Zealand anthology for publication to be titled The Maori Captivity Narratives, 20 first-hand accounts, and I hope to have that published by the end of next year. This year I'm also writing a series for the Tauranga Historical Society blog on early European visitors and vessels to Tauranga, and that's a good lead-in to today's topic, Ngāi Tarangi's defence of Tauranga and the Ngāpuhi invasions of 1831 and 1832. This photo shows part of sunny Tauranga in the Bay of Plenty, which from the 1300s has been a most desirable place to live. You'll know as local historians that before the European settlers arrived, Tauranga was occupied by successive waves of Māori settlers, including Waitaha, Ngā Marama, Ngāti Ranganui, and Ngāi Tarangi from the 1700s. This generic sketch shows a pre-European hapu defending their pa with traditional raka Māori weapons of stone, bone and wood. And this was a scene that was played out many times in Tauranga before the treaty. Between 1818 and 1844, actually, Ngāi Tarangi was subjected to a relentless wave of attacks by hostile iwi to the north and south, most armed with muskets and bent on their destruction. This image shows Tauranga Harbour by night, and I want you to imagine for a moment, try to picture, if you will, Tauranga Harbour, seen by the light of the moon during Ngāpuhi's siege of Otamotai Pa, 187 years ago. The defenders are watching a group of Ngāpuhi warriors stuck fast in the quicksands below the Pa, and the location of their suffering is Tilby Point on the Otamotai foreshore. All attempts by their Ngāpuhi comrades to free them have failed, and they have been abandoned. For 3 days and nights they have remained trapped with their heads barely above the full tides. When the sufferers call out to their would-be victims for sustenance during the stillness of the nights, Ngāi Tarangi from the pa above call to them contemptuously, kai aorero, or eat your tongues, by which name I believe Tilby Point is still known to Ngāi Tarangi. This callous response of the Otamotai people is not unsurprising, seen in the context of these turbulent times and the enormous military, economic and social stresses then weighing upon the Tauranga hapu during the intertribal musket wars. This painting shows a haka performed by Te Arawa at Makatu Pa, an iwi that made frequent incursions into this area during the intertribal wars. In 1844, they made their last unsuccessful attack and siege of Otamotai Pa, and in 1845, a permanent peace was made with Ngāi Tarangi under the old titoki tree that still stands at Otamotai Pa. This is a Ngāpuhi musket haka. Ngāpuhi were strategically situated in the Bay of Islands, and they were the first tribe to contain large numbers of muskets. They invaded Tauranga on 7 occasions between 1818 and 1833, and their raids on other tribes set off a chain reaction as iwi elsewhere in the North Island competed to arm themselves, and once armed, often turned on their neighbours to settle old scores. This Ngāi Tarangi haka was sketched by Major Robley before the clash with Imperial troops at Gate Power in 1864. Ngāi Tarangi's population had been reduced by war, and introduced diseases to just between 900 and 1,000 at this time. But they were still capable of fierce resistance, and you get something of that in the image. Between 1818 and 1840, iwi or tribes under threat elsewhere in New Zealand were forced to abandon their ancestral lands and to make 40 hekes or migrations to safer regions, including the Chatham Islands. Naitarangi, however, remained. Several other major North Island iwi also refused to be driven from their rohi, but the sheer number, regularity, scale and intensity of the attacks on Naitarangi during the Musket Wars, however, is remarkable. Today, Tauranga continues to be subject to less destructive invasions, most recently by large numbers of visitors from the cruise ships now visiting the harbour, and the large influx of New Zealanders from other regions, Auckland in particular. This New Zealand post stamp shows the mission schooner Herald, which, contrary to popular myth, was not the first European vessel to visit Tauranga. In the winter of 1825, Tauranga chiefs visiting the Bay of Islands told Henry Williams that they had been visited by European traders and that they had helped to unload barrels from the visiting ships. Presumably the barrels contained gunpowder or perhaps rum or a mixture of both. But certainly the Herald was the first ship identified by name to visit this harbour. When the missionary Henry Williams arrived in 1826, he estimated that Naitarangi could muster 2,500 fighting men. He saw 1,000 waka, large and small, on one beach in the harbour that teemed with fish and shellfish. For the previous 12 years, Naitarangi had repulsed many musket tawa or expeditions, while they were only armed with traditional raka Māori weapons, but not without cost. Mount Maunganuipa fell during Ngāpuhi's first great musket campaign in 1818, and when Otamataha Pa fell in 1828, the need to acquire flintlock guns became a condition of their survival. This was a scene that was played out many times in Tauranga during the 1820s. By the mid-1820s, the harbour had become a popular destination for specialist Sydney and Hobart gun trading ships. Regular visitors to the harbour included vessels like the Harways, New Zealander, John Dunscombe and the Prince of Denmark. Some of the big American whalers probably stood off this harbour, as they did at so many peninsulas and harbours around the New Zealand coast. James Belich found that one American trader had turned up with 700 muskets to trade in the 1820s. But in Tauranga, large acreages were cleared and planted in European crops, particularly potatoes, and herds of pigs for the musket trade. With the assistance of their Pākehā Māori traders like James Farrow, Scott, Peter Dillon, and others, the Hapu exchanged dress flax, European crops, pigs with the shipping for flintlock guns, gunpowder, ammunition, and the occasional cannon. So what types of gunpowder weapons were Naitarangi compelled to import during the 1830s to ensure their survival? Here we have a carved trade musket, generic name Pu or Hakimana. I think the name Intertribal Musket Wars is something of a misnomer, as many different types of flintlock guns as well as cannon were imported in that period. Given a name by their proud owners, the muskets were carefully maintained and the woodwork intricately carved. The metalwork was polished till the weapon glittered, and incorporated into massed haka, they made a spectacular display. They were accurate to about 50 yards, and leading rangatira lined the interior walls of their houses with racks of new and antiquated muskets. This gun at Te Papa in Wellington is a highly polished tupara, or double-barreled gun. They were a mix of sporting and cast-off shotguns and double-barreled military muskets. Tupara were prized for their reliability and capacity to deliver a vital second shot during close combat. In 1827, a single-barreled musket cost 1 tonne of dressed flax, 10 large pigs, or 120 baskets of potatoes, but a tupara cost twice that price. Here we have a pair of flintlock pistols. Regarded as chiefly weapons, they were carried in the waist belt alongside the mere punama. Rangatira generally preferred the large horse or cavalry pistols for their stopping power at close range. The next weapon is an English blunderbuss held at Te Papa. Called thunder guns by Māori, the blunderbusses were popular for their short length and shotgun effect. The bell-shaped mouth made for fast, easy loading, and it produced ruinous casualties at close range. This dramatic shipwreck scene shows HMS Buffalo in serious trouble off Whitianga, July 1840. And this Royal Naval vessel made several visits to this coast, the east coast, looking for timber during the 1830s, during which it sold enormous numbers of guns, including 7-barrel volley guns to the East Coast tribes. And that is a knock 7-barreled volley gun. A very formidable looking weapon used by the Royal Navy sailors to clear their decks during the Napoleonic Wars. Māori were initially attracted by these cast-off Royal Navy weapons, as all 7 barrels could be discharged simultaneously. The trader Joel Polak reported in 1834 that Māori no longer liked these weapons for the same reasons as Royal Navy sailors. They were difficult to load, they frequently misfired, and when they did fire, they kicked like a mule. All these weapons had a high attrition rate. They rusted out very quickly in New Zealand's climate, and the Māori habit of loading them with pebbles and speed loading reduced their longevity. Māori would simply pour the gunpowder down the barrel of a weapon, slam the musket on the ground, or the weapon on the ground to set the gunpowder, spit the musket ball or musket balls down the barrels, slam the weapon on the ground to set the musket balls, cock the piece and fire it, which was not good for the longevity of those weapons. The next image shows a 50-pound barrel of gunpowder, which was the standard weights at the time were 25 and 50 pounds. They were very expensive. Some inland and isolated West Coast tribes manufactured their own gunpowder with the assistance of their own Pākehā Māori, though most of this powder was poor quality. It was full of impurities. The most famous Māori gunpowder maker of the period was Pipi Ropata of Ngāti Ruanui in Taranaki. He was making better and better gunpowder until he unfortunately blew himself up. Like other coastal tribes, Tauranga was never plagued by shortages. It was simply visited too often by the gun trading vessels. This front cover image of the book Tribal Guns and Tribal Gunners depicts a typical ship's cannon of the period. This one was located at Spirits Bay in Northland. They were very old weapons, often a century more old. They took about 600 or 700 shots, and then you had to scrap them. So these were the sorts of weapons being sold to Māori on rotten carriages or weakly constructed carriages. But during the 1820s and early 1830s, an artillery craze swept tribal New Zealand as the leading chiefs competed to import ships' cannon for attack and defence. By 1836, I found that 120 rangatira around New Zealand's coast had obtained 165 great guns between them, and 22 of these weapons still survive, mainly located on ancestral marae. Otamotai Pā had at least 2 cannon, Mongatapu Pā and Matapihi, 1 apiece, and I think that all the other Tauranga Pā probably had at least 1 gun apiece, given the highly competitive nature of inter-hapu relationships at the time. This caricature shows the chief Ngārara, or the lizard, of Ngāti Awa at nearby Whakatane. We mustn't imagine for one moment that Ngāi Tarangi were helpless victims and shrinking violets in this period. They conducted their own land and sea-based raids, and they attacked Ngāti Awa and the people at Whakatane in 1829. This image shows the Ngāti Kahangunu Pākehā Māori Barnett Burns with his fine tāmoko. Ngāi Tarangi captured Burns during one of their raids along the Bay of Plenty coast about 1832. Burns agreed to remain with Ngāi Tarangi and to be tattooed and to fight for them. He fled, however, with his face half tattooed. They considered him, therefore, a most ungrateful fellow. They said, he's run off without tāmoko. Burns had his tāmoko completed by his own tribe. But what interests me, this would have been done over many months, so as raiders, they would have brought him back to Tauranga to have the tāmoko done, or half done in his case. So I want to focus now on Te Haramiti's campaign to Tauranga in 1831. And this photograph shows Motiti Island, which is just 10 miles northeast of our present location. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the island, you will see Motiti Spit, which was the scene of battle. Military tacticians assert that attack is the best means of defence, and in 1831, Ngāi Tarangi attacked and defeated a combined Ngāti Kuri and Ngāpuhi force on Motiti Spit. The invaders were led by Te Haramiti, a tohanga, or priest of Ngāti Kuri, and this was tribal New Zealand's first long-distance seaborne artillery campaign. Although he was old and blind, the tohanga believed that his two cannon would avenge the losses Ngāti Kuri and Ngāpuhi had suffered during previous attacks on Tauranga. This is Frederick Manning, the Ngāpuhi trader I referred to. My sources for this battle include the missionary journals of Henry Williams and William Fairburn, who interviewed the Tauranga chiefs soon after the battle, and Frederick Manning, who interviewed a Ngāpuhi survivor, and also Wiremu, Rangi Kaheke, and Arawa, Musket Wars veteran, who also wrote about this battle. Here we have an 18-pound carronade, or short-barreled cannon, and one of Te Haramiti's cannon. He brought two cannon down to Motiti. It was an 18-pounder, a massive gun of English manufacture, almost 5 feet in length. It weighed approximately 1,000 pounds, or half an imperial ton. You might recognise the next weapon. It's from the buried village at Tarawera. It's a 9-pound carronade. These lightweight mobile pieces were keenly sought by the Musket chiefs, and Te Haramiti's second weapon was a 9-pounder. The expedition was joined by 2 Ngāpuhi contingents at the Bay of Islands, and Te Haramiti's expedition, comprising some 200 fighting men, voyaged south to the Bay of Plenty in 7 Wakatawa with the 2 cannon in the hulls as ballast. The Māori found that cannon and waka were made for each other because the waka, of course, was stabilised and they were load-bearing vehicles. This image shows the sand spit on Motiti Island, which became the scene of battle. After successful attacks by Māori by the expedition on Mercury and Mare Islands, or Tahua, the expedition crossed to Motiti, where they beached their 7 waka on the southeastern side, or the left-hand side of Motiti Spit, a formation of packed sand covered by the sea at full tide. To guard against surprise attack, they camped at Huripupo, a slightly elevated plateau, long since eroded away, in the middle section of the spit, which we can see curving away to the old Taumahi Pa. The island's inhabitants had fled, so the invaders sustained themselves by shooting pigs and plundering the plantations. At Tauranga itself, the leading Ngāi Tarangi chief, Tupāa, hastily assembled a force of 1,000 fighting men. It included some Ngāti Hawa and the chief Te Waharoa from Matamata, and some Whakatohia with the chief Te Toko from Opotiki. Having first visited Tauranga in 1826, when muskets were still scarce and highly prized. And astonished Henry Williams noted in 1831, each boy has 2 or 3 guns and men 10. So they've become quite saturated with muskets. At noon the next day, the Northerners saw a large fleet of waka approaching from Tuhua. A number of Ngāti Kuri rushed recklessly along the spit to the beach below the island to welcome what they believed were reinforcements, crying, "Here are the Ngāpuhi. Here is the fulfilment of Te Haramiti's prophecy." The old tauhanga had a vision that night of a large fleet arriving from the north. The Tauranga fleet meanwhile slowed and stopped some distance from the island to allow the warriors refreshment and for the leading chiefs to confer. Their plan of attack combined surprise, speed and interlocking fields of musket fire. The joy of the invaders gave way to confusion when the Ngāti Hei Waka on the right wing of the fleet swept round to the south end of the island of the spit to deny them access to Taumahi Pa and to prevent their escape by sea. Confusion turned to dismay when the Tauranga Waka drove swiftly ashore at the spit's northern end, which also cut off the invaders' retreat from the island itself. At the Battle of Ravenna in 1512, a single cannonball felled 33 soldiers, and the 2 cannon turned the confined battlefield on Motiti Spit into a very dangerous place. Fired at short range at warriors attacking along a narrow spit, the 1918 pounders were truly lethal and for a brief time served as great equalizers. During the final onslaught from 2 directions and the ferocious hand-to-hand fighting that followed, Te Haramiti once again called for his cannon to be fired, but his gunners had already been overrun and killed. With the loss of the great guns, the northern musketeers, who had stood courageously to return fire, finally gave ground and were scattered and annihilated. When Te Haramiti was recognised by some men of Ngaitarangi, they beat him to death with their fists rather than shed his sacred blood. Tiki Whenua, a famous Ngāti Kuri fighting man and hero, fearing that he would be taken alive, placed his chest to the barrel of the 9-pounder before igniting it with a fire stick. Tiki Whenua, good night, as Frederick Manning said in his book. Just 2 northerners survived the battle. One managed to make the long swim across to Makatu without being seen. The other, the son of a Ngāpuhi chief, was spared to tell the sad tale in the north. Throughout history, there are many examples of a small force armed with artillery defeating and dispersing a much larger one, but not on Motiti. Deployed for the first time as field guns against Tupaia, a musket wars general noted for his tactical acumen, Te Haramiti's Purepa, or great guns, did not give him the overwhelming advantage over muskets that he had hoped for. This scene is entitled A Dreadful Recognition. The victorious Ngaitarangi later sold the toi moko, or cured tattooed heads, of the defeated northern chiefs to Captain Jack of the Prince of Denmark schooner. He attempted to sell them at the Bay of Islands. When the prospective buyers recognized the toi moko of their own relatives, they were outraged, and they fled ashore swearing vengeance. When Captain Jack and his crew saw a number of war canoes assembling on shore, they promptly departed for Sydney. Let's have a look now at Te Tore's campaign to Tauranga in 1832. This portrait of Te Tore Takeri, and I'll just spell it for you, Te Tore, T-I-T-O-R-E, and Takeri, T-A-K-I-R-I, was painted by the artist James Barry when the young chief visited London with his companion Tuai in 1817. A Ngāpuhi chief with extensive kinship ties, Te Tore left the Bay of Islands for Sydney in 1815, where he stayed with the missionary leader Samuel Marsden. But he led his own musket raids to Thames and the East Coast during the 1820s, and he became the leading chief war chief at the Bay of Islands following the death of Hongi Hika in 1827. The missionary Henry Williams, James Kemp and William Fairbairn accompanied Te Tori's expedition in the hope of negotiating peace, and I've drawn heavily on their journals to provide this account of the campaign. A former Royal Navy officer, Henry Williams, was clearly fascinated by Māori attempts to use artillery, and for a missionary, his description of the battle is surprisingly detailed. Ever appreciative of a hearty meal, Williams recorded, "Our good wives have provided us with pies, plum puddings, preserved fish, pickles, hams, bacon, eggs, etc. So they're going to be well provisioned for the voyage." This sketch by Henry Williams shows the mission sailing cutter Karere, or messenger, and part of the invasion fleet en route to Tauranga. In March 1832, Te Tori's fleets sailed for Tauranga. There were 80 waka and several sailing cutters. There were 800 warriors and a siege train of 10 great guns. They employed south in 3 divisions, raiding the plantations with both enemy and allied iwi as they went. This is a photograph of Waikanai marae in the far north, Hokianga Heads. They still have these 3 artillery pieces on the marae. One of them was actually transported on a cutter called the Taiopa, owned by the chief Arama P. He sailed it around North Cape to join the campaign at the Bay of Islands, down to Tauranga to take part in the 2 sieges I'll tell you about, and then back all the way around North Cape to Hokianga, quite a feat of seamanship. The invading force comprised Tapu from the Bay of Islands, Whangaroa, Takao, which is north of the Bay of Islands, North Cape and the Hokianga. The 10 great guns comprised 2 cannon and 8 carronades. With a combined weight of several tons, it was the largest artillery train assembled during the Musket Wars. Te Tori may have believed that his great guns and muskets together would act as a type of steamroller, a Māori version of blitzkrieg that would finally destroy the powerful fortress and defenders of Otamotai Pa. I think you will recognise that particular image, that scene. By 1832, all the great North Island iwi fortifications had fallen to Musket armies, and Otamotai Pa alone remained unconquered. The watchtower atop Otamotai Pa provided their eagle-eyed observers with sweeping views of the Bay of Plenty and the beaches of the inner harbour. When the hostile fleet was finally sighted off Waihi on the 6th of March, local waka were dispatched to carry the news far and wide. At every pa in Tauranga, Naitarangi finished reinforcing their defences. They harvested the last of their crops. They drove in the pigs, closed the storehouses filled with fern root, dried fish and shellfish, and topped up and covered their clay water cisterns. This photo shows part of a Waikato River regatta, but we're going to pretend for our purposes that it's part of Te Tori's fleet on Tauranga Harbour. On the morning of the 17th of March, the population of Otamotai Pa, including the traders, awoke to the fantastic sight of a Grand Ngāpuhi amphibious expedition under sail. With the warriors and vessels ornamented for war, musket barrels glittering and war trumpets blaring, the enemy fleet, flying a multitude of battle flags, as they called them, from the shipping, moved ominously up the harbour towards them from the Katikati entrance. This diagram of Otamotai Pa was made by a visiting naval officer in 1844, and it clearly shows the obstacles facing the Ngāpuhi invaders in 1832. Let's go to this side. You can see what a formidable fortress it was. There were, in this lower diagram, there was a deep fossil defensive ditch. There was a double row of palisades around 4 sides of the pa. The palisades extended behind the defensive ditch all the way down to the beach shore, So it was very, very well protected. Ngā Puhi moved their artillery pieces into this position along the Ferguson Coolum Park walkway, and Naitarangi had very, very cleverly extended the great outer ditch along the base of the cliff that you'll all be familiar with. So they were drawn into this particular area, and they used their 10 artillery pieces to bombard, I suspect, the focus there on the western gate on this side of the park. You can see from the cross-section here just what a formidable fortress it was. Te Tore's expedition was about to confront a well-led, resolute and heavily armed Te Mara Waho Hapu, who were determined to defend their rohi. The principal... Oh, sure. Yes, Te Tore's tawa was about to confront the well-led, resolute and heavily armed Te Mara Waho Hapu, who were determined to defend their rohi. The principal fortress of Naitarangi, Otomotai Pā, was the residence of the paramount chief Hori Tupaia and supporting chiefs like Hikaria, Tingamari and Tahorangi. One resident trader, Joseph Montefiore, estimated that the defending warriors numbered 500. Fearing the destructive potential of Te Tore's artillery, Naitarangi had installed at least 2 great guns in the defences, obtained from the shipping or perhaps their own Pākehā Māori traders. This photo shows the Arawa Pākehā Māori, Philip Tapsell, in old age. And that's a pity, as a young man he was very dynamic, noted for his courage and daring. When they buried him, they buried him with a red jacket that he was a former pirate in his pirate's jacket with a spyglass, his flintlock pistols, his sword, and then they put a big cannon on top to keep him down. And the grave is still over there at Makatu, although the locals won't tell you where it is. Okay. Before the siege, Tapsell, whose wife Karuhi was Ngā Puhi, sailed his cutter, the ferry, into the harbour to deliver 6 additional cannon. He had 12 up there on the Pā at Makatu. The Otomotai gunners bombarded Tapsell's cutter while he was offloading these cannon onto Waka out in the channel, but Henry Williams noted that they were unable to strike the vessel. And as I mentioned, Ngā Puhi made their camp to the west of Otomotai Pā, near the start of the Ferguson Park, Coolum Park walkway. This image shows the Ngā Puhi cannon at Ruapekapeka Pā in the Bay of Islands, which has now been fully restored. At dawn on the 16th of March, 1832, my birthday actually, but I wasn't born in 1832, the Otomotai people were subjected to a thunderous day-long bombardment, which delivered the sickening thud of iron and stone cannonballs against the palisades and the hiss of deadly wood splinters. Ngā Puhi's more wayward gunnery sent the nerve-jangling shriek of stone grape shot over and into the Pā itself. The bombardment and counter-bombardment produced vast quantities of smoke that characterized all smoothbore artillery exchanges, from the wars in ancient China to the recently ended Napoleonic Wars. It stung the eyes, it seared the lungs, it left an acid taste in the mouth, and at times the gunners may have fired in virtual blindness. This image shows Te Mara Waho greeting some of the visitors to their Pā, and Otomotai's beach-level palisades, which were the target of Te Tore's artillery barrage. The Otomotai artillerymen replied with their own counter-bombardment, and during the 1960s, Mr. Morris Tongo of Judea Pā unearthed a dozen cannonballs scattered below the western end of the Pā that gives testimony to this historic intertribal artillery exchange. Meanwhile, on the plateau above, Henry Williams from the Matua Iwi Pa watched through his spyglass parties of loading and firing Ngāpuhi musketeers advancing on the pa from three sides. Using movable log bridges and ladders to cross the outer ditches, strong groups of equally determined Ngaitarangi emerged from the sally ports to drive them off. Henry Williams noted that during the siege, Ngāpuhi's infantry were never allowed to get closer to the pa than 200 yards. It's a very clever tactic, active defence. Here we have a modern-day schooner firing a ship's cannon. During the siege, Captain George Clark and the Hokianga-built schooner, New Zealander, which had formed strong trading ties with the Ngaitarangi people, entered the harbour at first light. Sweeping along the Otamotai Channel, it bombarded the sleeping Ngāpuhi encampment near Ferguson Park. Quite a wake-up call, I think. 6 Ngāpuhi waka with Tapsel's cannon already mounted in the bows. They were expecting a seaborne attack, according to their intelligence sources. They chased and exchanged fire with the schooner in New Zealand's only Māori and Pākehā gunpowder naval battle. We do have a very exciting history here in Tauranga. This cannonball, which is located in Tauranga Central Library, was unearthed near the western entrance to the pa, possibly from the siege. By late afternoon, Ngāpuhi, realising that their great guns would not smash the much anticipated breaches in Otamotai's defences, resigned themselves to a siege that was to last 2 weeks, during which Ngāpuhi continued to fire their cannon occasionally. Describing the bad luck and stoicism of one defender, one Pākehā Māori trader reported, "One man was killed by a cannonball which came through the fence and knocked his leg off as easily as if it had been a boiled potato. When he saw that his leg was off above the knee, he cried out, 'Look here, the iron has run away with my leg.' What playful creatures these cannonball are." When he said this, he fell back and died, smiling as brave warriors do. These twin cannon you may have seen on the main street of Kohu in the Hokianga. Originally, they were from the Boyd, that terrible massacre of the Boyd up in Whangaroa in 1809. But they were taken by Hongi Hika, the great Musket chief, and used in the siege of Taratarapa at Whangaroa, 1827. And his brother, Moka, later inherited these, and he brought them down to Tauranga during the siege. Early one morning, a handpack squad of Ngaitarangi rushed across the western causeway, killed the gunners, seized and dragged off the Chief Moka's 2 twin cannon, which were positioned closest to the pa. They were driven back and forced to abandon the 2 cannon, both sides suffering losses during this and subsequent clashes outside the pa. By the 25th of March, Titori's siege had become untenable. Otamotai's stout palisades and deep-firing trenches had proved impervious to artillery fire. The obstinate defenders, understanding the value of active defence, had beaten back every advance by Ngāpuhi. Soon after, Ngaitarangi were reinforced by Waikato and Arawa contingents who managed to get into the pa during the siege. Titori raised the siege of the Otamotai pa and moved off to attack Monga Tapu, located on the inner harbour. This character, Tomika Timutu, was one of the leading defenders and defending chiefs of Monga Tapu. He was one of the most photographed and painted men of that period, 1860s and 70s. You could see why he absolutely fascinated visiting artists and photographers. Monga Tapu Pa. A famous and formidable fortress, Mongatapu was the home of the Ngāti Hei clan of Ngaitarangi and the supporting chiefs, Kihiroa, Kaiawa and Timutu. Located on the end of a peninsula, the pa was defended by at least one cannon with sheer cliffs on three sides and a great ditch and stockade on the landward side. The record of events surrounding Ngāpuhi's 3-week siege are fragmentary. The pa was initially bombarded from the landward side, where, according to Henry Williams, the musketeers on each side clashed several times, with some being killed on either side. Here we have the Ngāpuhi chief, the nephew of Hongihika. This is Honiheke Pokai, his famous wife and advisor, Harriet Rongo, and the elderly chief, Kaweti Te Ruki, who took on the British troops during the Flagstaff War of 1845. Actually, Heke was a keen artillerist, and he later achieved fame by killing and maiming British troops with a cannon during their attack on Ohio-Waipa. He was shot in the neck during one of the attacks at Mongatapu Pa. Fortunately, he fell into the fern and he was retrieved by his comrades, but he was sent back to the Bay of Islands to recover. This beachside encampment was painted by the visiting artist Augustus Earle in 1827. After Henry Williams and his missionaries visited the Ngāpuhi camp on the Matapihi side of the estuary on the 5th of April, he recorded, "Many shook their heads, signifying that they were tired, and others complained of want of food. Their attempts had failed. They had found that their opponents were not backward to meet them, and their great guns had been brought into action, but of no use. They had dragged them close to the pa, that's Otomotai, for 2 days after we sailed, and were firing nearly the whole day without any effect, but had sustained losses themselves, and the 2 guns belonging to Moka had nearly fallen into the enemy's hands." It was this combination of war weariness, food and munition shortages, an ineffective artillery arm, and a growing casualty list that saw Ngāpuhi lift the siege of Mongatapu Pa and depart Tauranga with their great guns in the second week of April 1832. Henry Williams later reported that several waka stood too far out to sea, and those canoes and their gunners and their occupants were lost along with the great guns. In conclusion, here we have a sketch made of Titori Takeri following his campaign to Tauranga. He died and left no descendants, but the concentration of between 6 and 7 tons of artillery in the Tauranga area by Ngāpuhi and Ngaitarangi in 1832 is remarkable, indicative of the rapidly changing nature and sheer expense of Māori warfare. Titori's campaign is also notable for its use of indigenous tribesmen in the role of artillerymen, using the specialist tools and equipment necessary to transport artillery and overcome the problems of operating it in the field. While his campaign proved a daring and inconclusive experiment in siege warfare, in the context of distances travelled and obstacles overcome, it was nevertheless an extraordinary achievement in logistics. And our last image, here we have Hori Kingi Te Paia of Ngaitarangi, the paramount chief and tactician. Ngaitarangi's successful defence of Tauranga between 1818 and 1884 was founded on shrewd generalship, their impregnable fortresses, their clever military alliances, and their rapid assimilation and deployment of Western military technology. It was also founded on efficient logistics, ensuring sufficient food and water during long sieges, and above all, the tactic of active defence. Titori Takeri's campaign to Tauranga was the last of the great Ngāpuhi invasions. I'll stop at that point and finish with that nice image.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bentley. What a fascinating insight into the Bay of Plenty's early intertribal warfare. Questions, folks? I'm sure you've got a few questions for Dr. Bentley. Yes, Lindley.
Trevor, I was wondering where Ngātarangi came from before they got here to Tauranga. And were they the ones that took over at the Battle of Cora, about the Red Ochre on the Mount, the sort of Trojan horse invasion?
This was my first military history, so I focused on a fairly narrow area of military history. The siege of Otamoto was my main interest. In terms of long-term background and the various populations and shifts, but I know they certainly migrated up the east coast. They were in the Opotiki area for a time before shifting into Tauranga and moving out the existing population. Other people might be more expert on that area. Not my field.
Other questions? Yeah.
How much did the Maoris wish to obtain cannon, musket, shot and powder interfere with their previous economy? Did it mean that the tribe would have to put a lot of effort into it, or was it using surpluses or whatever?
Yes, it required the full resources of the tribe to accumulate, to purchase and accumulate these arsenals. As I mentioned, it was a condition of survival. And during this period, the 1820s and 30s, we had the biggest upsurge in slave-taking in the history of New Zealand. A typical musket raid by Ngāpuhi, 3 or 4 of their major raids, typically they killed 2,000 people. Places like Rotorua, their major raids to the Waikato against the Auckland people. They returned with 2,000 slaves from each of those major expeditions, plus hundreds of slaves brought back by other tribes during their musket expeditions. So they were put to work in the potato fields, producing vast quantities of potato provisions for the whaling ships to purchase more muskets. Such was the demand for labour that they were enticing seamen ashore and then enslaving them, which is what my current book is about, and forcing them to work in the potato fields. So any able-bodied person, and all those hundreds of runaway sailors who were seeking refuge from their very brutal captains, who entered or given shelter in Māori communities close to the coast or further inland, were put to work. So there was no such thing as an idle person during the intertribal musket wars. So it was these former semi-subsistence economies that Māori had became commercial economies, and anything they could get, timber, they became very good at producing and assisting the sawyers in producing sawn timber. They worked at the whaling station, but a lot of the trade goods they were paid with were in the shape of muskets and powder. So they certainly benefited from their workable accords with the European entrepreneurs. So those were another source of weaponry. Certainly flax trading was very profitable, but the most profitable item of trade was a toi moko, or tattooed head, and hundreds of them were exported to Britain and Europe, to museums and to private collectors. One toi moko, one musket. So you can imagine the sheer number of heads that were being shipped offshore. And it was an industry. So many were going to Sydney before they were transshipped to Britain. But the Sydney people, customs people, entered them in their books as imports, subheading baked heads, New Zealand baked heads. So yes, all tribal energy sources were mobilised in these turbulent times.
Maureen.
Thank you, Trevor. Can you just, or would you know about the casualties and how the Māori people went about caring for the people who got injured or were rather majorly injured?
I don't know a great deal, just gathered a little bit of information over the years during my researches. I have seen sketches showing Māori casualties being brought from battlefields on litters, and the expeditions were always accompanied by women who were skilled in the arts of surgery. When John Rutherford went into battle, he was seen by other Europeans going into battle armed with a greenstone mere, 2 flintlock pistols and a double-barrelled gun. And at the Battle of Te Ika, Aranganui, near modern-day Kaiwaka on the Hokianga, he was struck in the thigh by a barbed spearhead. And that spearhead was removed over many hours by 2 Māori women operating with an oyster shell in a major feat of surgery, but left a cup hole, teacup-sized hole in his thigh for the rest of his life. So they had people who was basically skilled. We know that many of the warriors could recover from the most remarkable wounds. When Elizabeth Gard was wrecked on the Harriet on the Taranaki coast in 1834, she was struck on the head twice with a tomahawk but survived that. She was nursed back to health by her Māori mentors, and during her 5-month captivity she had fallen in love with a 19-year-old, she was 19, a 19-year-old chief, a young chief called Oiti. And the sailors, 2 British warships turned up to rescue her, HMS Alligator and the Isabella. And during the exchange, they were negotiating the exchange, Oiti for Elizabeth Gard, but the whalers and sailors aboard the ship got carried away and they bayoneted and shot Oiti. Yet he survived from these horrific wounds, treated by the surgeon on HMS Alligator and Māori healers. Many of the warriors were able to recover, I know, because they simply plugged the bullet wounds with mixtures of shrubs and clay, which was quite remarkable. But the missionaries say time and time again how astounded they are at the way Māori were able to recover at the most basic, with the most basic treatment supplied by, often by the tohunga, male and female, who were skilled in the art of healing wounds and enabling people to recover from sicknesses. So over the course of hundreds of years they did have a body of medical knowledge which seems to have been pretty effective.
Megan.
Tēnā koe. I'm just going over that Motiti, is it Motiti Island event on the Spit. So what was that, Ngāpui versus Naitarangi? And the person, Tuku Whenua, he turned the gun on himself. What was the result? Why did he do that again? And what was the reason?
Frederick Manning talks about Tuku Whenua. He was a great Ngāti Kuri fighting man who had built up a reputation over many years. He was also a chief. And some chiefs, rather than be killed, most chiefs were killed. A few very senior paramount chiefs might be kept as prisoners and then given back to the tribe, surrendered to the enemy tribe, with the belief that they should reciprocate at some later date. But not being a high chief, he knew he would have been killed, cooked and devoured, and that was a great shame. That was the last thing he wanted. He had this fabulous reputation as a hero and fighting man in his tribe. And to the Maori mind, he went out in style. And they would not have forgotten that story. It's the only time I've ever heard of a warrior committing suicide rather than be taken alive. Some of the chiefs, when they were being chased and pursued by common warriors, would say to those pursuers, look, here is my greenstone medi. If you can kill me with this, I will go out, not in style. If you kill me with your common weapon, it will be a great shame and a source of shame to me, my reputation, my people. So they're very conscious of their reputations and their standings and how they're going to be remembered. Yeah.
Susan.
1827, 1828. Was it a sub-tribe living here on these very grounds we are on? Because we know when the missionaries arrived, there was nobody living here. Was that part of the Otomotai tribe or the Mangatapu?
It was a completely different iwi, hapu living here, and they were pretty much completely massacred in 1828. They were caught in a night attack, and I think there was a Ngāti Maru expedition that did that, not Ngāpuhi. So this area was pretty much tapu. A tribe could conquer another tribe and occupy their pa, but if your pa and your people had been destroyed, killed and eaten on site, you never went back again. Yes, that's the location. That's the location. Yes, that was a really, really sad event. Quite a formidable pa, because Henry Williams and his companions described it. It was quite surprising that, and when you look at it today, with the sheer cliffs, so it's quite possible some slacker guard left a gate unguarded, and they managed to get in that way. But get in they did. They got into the inside of the pa and then attacked the sleeping people. It was a terrible business. The aftermath described by the missionary, pretty horrific. It was. But I can't remember the name of the hapu, but some of you may know. Yeah.
Okay, Lindley.
In this era of the gun warfare, were they still heavily into ritualistic cannibalism to dispose of the bodies and to absorb the mana of the enemy as they cannibalised them?
Yes, certainly things were changing at the Bay of Islands, and during the 1830s, because of missionary influences, very few people were being cooked and devoured, but not so in Tauranga during the 1830s. Once Ngāpuhi got away from doing interfactional fighting at the Bay of Islands, they didn't eat each other. But when they made their expeditions, they continued in the old ways. But it was interesting, the transition to Christianity. Māori just didn't throw away their old beliefs. They synthesized traditional Māori beliefs with new Christian ideals and various teachings that suited them. So it was possible in 1830s New Zealand to be attacked and killed by your tribal enemies on any day of the week except Sunday, because that tribe professed to be Christian. And it was possible also to be attacked, killed, cooked and eaten by Māori who had taken biblical names from the missionaries, and they were very proud of these biblical names. So New Zealand was very much in a state of transition, but certainly out on Motiti Spit, all of those people were cooked, killed and eaten. They fired off those 2 captured cannon in celebration. There were cannonball found further inshore in the island, either from the battle itself or from those celebrations. One of the cannon went back to Mongatapu Pa, the little cannon, because one of the chiefs from that part placed his hand on it first and claimed it. The big cannon went to a Potiki, but they took up They smoke-dried the flesh. Typically, if there were any prisoners or slaves, they had them backpack those packs of human flesh back home again where people could take part in feasting there. But most of the people on Maititi were cooked and devoured on site. So 1830 is very much a transitional time. And Pākehā, lawless Pākehā, the criminal Pākehā, ended up in the ovens as well. They transgressed. There was continued kai tangatoa cannibalism into the 40s in some remoter interior regions. Certainly no accounts by the 1850s, although once the Hauhau warriors got going and the British troops were here, some of their factions adopted ritualised cannibalism again. And some of the bodies of the captured soldiers were interfered with.
Right. Any other questions? Okay, well, it's just left to me to say a very warm thank you to Dr. Bentley for his thoroughly interesting presentation today, and to present you with a small token of our appreciation for your time and effort. So thank you very much. Well, folks, now let's go and have a cup of tea. Please join us, just over in the Fencible. Be nice and warm in there. We had the heater going. So, yeah, come and join us. We are underway. I'll hand it over to Dr. Bentley. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Andrew. Kia ora koutou. Hena iwi a paene. Tēnā koutou. Good afternoon, everyone. I've had a lifelong interest in reading and writing and researching about the interaction of Māori and Pākehā in pre-treaty New Zealand, especially the Pākehā who crossed cultures voluntarily and involuntarily and lived as Māori in Māori communities. And that fascination began about the age of 13 when I read this book called Old New Zealand by Frederick Manning, which some of you no doubt have read. I think there's 20